Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon for the live panel discussion, which forms part of the Workplace and Facilities Expo's virtual festival. My name's Hugh Robinson, and I'm the Exhibition Director for Workplace and Facilities Expo Ireland, which unfortunately cannot be held physically due to the pandemic this year. However, Workplace and Facilities Expo will take place next year on the 1st and 2nd of March 2022 at the RDS in Dublin. The virtual festival commenced yesterday with the first two panel discussions, and today will be no different, having held a session on security this morning. Each of these panel discussions features industry leaders and experts discussing key areas affecting all those involved in creating safe and secure workplaces and facilities, whether in Ireland or internationally. As well as the live panel discussions, the festival also features a range of on-demand content which can be accessed through the Workplace and Facilities Expo website. This afternoon's webinar is entitled it's based on fire safety, and we look forward to hearing a lot more about fire safety management of occupied premises. In a slight change to our traditional format, each of the panelists will deliver a short PowerPoint presentation putting the subject into context before moving over to the traditional panel discussion format. This session is organised in association with the ASFP Ireland and the IFE Ireland branch, and I would like to thank them for their assistance in sourcing speakers and moderating the content. If you would like to ask a question, please put this through the chat room, and the panel will address these towards the end of the discussion. This webinar is recorded and will be uploaded onto the Workplace Facilities Expo website as additional on-demand content. The moderator for this afternoon's panel discussion is David O'Reilly, IFE Branch President and Chief Operations Officer, ASFP Ireland. So without further ado, I shall hand you over to David. David.
Thanks, Hugh. Good afternoon, everybody. This time last year we were in the RDS, and it was the last time that we got together in a normal situation. I would like to start today by saying that managing fire safety is a global concern. I attend two international forums each year: the International General Assembly of the Institution of Fire Engineers, where 43 representatives from the branches around the world get together, and the European Association for Passive Fire Protection. In both forums we meet twice a year, and the fire safety concerns are the same wherever we go. And despite what we may say as today progresses, we all face the same issues, and Ireland is in a relatively good place in my experience. And there. Just a little bit about IFE, a registered charity, international organization for fire professionals, awards internationally recognized membership grades and fire-related qualifications. Normally speaking, 6,000 plus fire-related exams per year. Unfortunately, none this March. The Association for Specialist Fire Protection was founded in 1975 in the UK, and I brought the association to Ireland in 2010, initially with a membership of manufacturers and specialist installers, expanded to include virtually everybody within the fire industry. Industry leaders providing guidance and education. Most recently in 2017, we set up a framework, for an educational framework for people involved in the passive industry. ASFP Foundation course is the basis for that education, and the IFE provide examination certification process, primarily aimed at the industry, but it has been of great benefit to others whose activities relate to managing passive fire protection. ASFP guidance supports, is industry guidance supporting regulatory guidance is probably the best way to put it. In 2006, in the last revision of TGDB, insurance best practice, our ASFP document was referenced. And if you only read one document on passive fire protection, this is the one I would recommend. As I said, last year we were in the RDS. 2 years ago, John Barry introduced fire safety in Ireland. John is Chris's colleague, who we'll be hearing from later on today. He gave us an introduction to the task force report. He mentioned that it was building on progress made under BCAR and looking at development of an understanding of the fire services acts, and heralded that there would be new guidance coming to assist managers and operators. That first document has been released today for public consultation, and we're going to hear more from Chris later to explain the background and where the department are going with this new guidance. The task force report looked at fire safety as 4 functions: passive fire safety, active fire safety, management, and behavior. I've highlighted management here because that's what we're going to talk about primarily today. But it also went into some more detail about managing passive and active fire safety. And again, we'll cover that in some detail as we progress. My first questions really is, how can fire safety be managed without understanding the design strategy for a building? And what consideration must designers give to future management and maintenance? For me, it's a cohesive approach, and it's like any team. It's as good as its weakest link. Any failure at any point along the way, and it can be rendered useless. I'm delighted to have an expert panel with us today. We've Air Massey, a facility manager with Acacia Facilities Management, Claire Smith, the chartered fire engineer and safety management consultant, covering the breadth of the subject, and Sean McElhaney from Dublin Fire Brigade, senior executive fire prevention officer. So without any from me until maybe later on, I'm going to hand over to Air, who will give a little bit of an introduction on himself and where he sees fire safety from a facility management point of view. Air.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everybody. So as David said, I'm the token FM guy here, basically. We amongst a very knowledgeable group. So just as David suggested, very quickly about myself and Acacia. So I'm technical director for Acacia. We are the largest Irish-owned FM provider at this stage in Ireland, and we are so it's primarily a managed service provider to a fairly large number of clients at this point, and we tend to work in the area of I suppose the best in class in terms of our clients, and that then fits with the type of service we provide. So we're all about ensuring that we provide the best solution that is available out there to our clients. We primarily work in the commercial and the healthcare sector. So admittedly, we don't work in the residential or the retail sector primarily, but we I suppose we have a lot of crossover with a lot of other industries as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just touch on, really, I'm going to try and keep this short and sweet. The first point I want to really make is that what has FM got to do with fire safety? And it ties in nicely with David's introduction, I guess, regarding the management piece. Where we tend to fit on behalf of our clients is that we, depending on our clients, we will manage all or some of the typical services non-core services that they have in there for their business. So you can see here typical examples. But really, the key point on this is that every one of these has some relevance to fire safety. That could be obviously from the point of view of us essentially on the client's behalf, reviewing all of the handover files, the safety documentation that comes with a new building, through to and by default then obviously ensuring that everything that we need to manage and operate that building in the long term is handed over properly. Particularly focusing on fire safety, obviously, it's all of the relevant paperwork and documentation regarding the design strategy, design intent of the building from a fire safety point of view. Obviously, most of that should be and typically would be covered in the fire safety certificate submission file. It's not often, I'm afraid, that we get all of that information in the handover documentation. We typically find that we're handed over the fire safety cert itself, and obviously for bigger sites there may be multiple versions and we may only get one. So it takes a lot of us pushing back and insisting that we get the full compartmentation drawings, the compliance report, and obviously if there are if there are more than one, if there's been more than one revision of the fire safety cert, that we get copies of the paper trails that went for each of them. Some of the other obvious ones, obviously, we're maintaining all the life safety systems themselves and managing. We have a very large range of specialist providers who we engage to do the majority of those. I've mentioned passive fire safety. So ideally, obviously, in a perfect world, everything is handed over and everything, all the passive systems like the fire stopping, the fire doors, the compartment, essentially the compartmentation throughout the building is 100%. It rarely is. So it's about us at that stage trying to get it to a point that it is as was designed to be, and from there on then trying to manage and maintain that to that level. Because the nature of a live building, there are always things that happen. New services are brought through, cables are run from point A to point B, all these sort of things. So they obviously have to be maintained. Other things, the non-fire systems, there are obviously a lot of systems that are indirectly related to fire safety. So it's about the awareness of how they tie in with the fire safety part of the building, and make sure that they're maintained properly. And then there's a number of what we refer to as soft services. So cleaning, reception services, catering services, security guarding, and all of these have a relevance. For example, the security guarding, more often than not, the guards will play a key part in fire drills and evacuation procedures. Same with reception services often. And then obviously in things like catering, you've got a whole specific group of fire risks relating to catering. So the key point here is that it isn't just a sort of a simple exercise. This is a complex piece, and we essentially form an umbrella over the whole thing. And so it's obviously really important that us and all providers of FM services in whatever form they take are equally aware and equally, I suppose, knowledgeable, but also knowledgeable of the systems, but also, I suppose, aware of how much they don't know, and therefore the need to bring in specialists. The other slide I have then is just focusing on from our point of view, from experience, what do we believe that are the challenges essentially to ensuring that the buildings are maintained safely and that fire safety is top of the priority list. So a couple of these are, I suppose, more straightforward and more obvious than others. We still find, despite BCAR and the goods that brought, we still find there are a lot of gaps between in the construction, between essentially from handover stage, from construction teams to ourselves or to the client. And I suppose in some cases we believe that it's down to a lack of awareness by those people on the construction side of how important it is and the need for us to maintain it afterwards, and how do we achieve that. And simple examples could be down to ensuring that we can get access to fire dampers, ensuring that, as I mentioned earlier, that the documentation is handed over properly at the start, all that sort of stuff. And so we believe that it's actually, in a lot of cases, it is probably down to education, and hope as time goes on that the relevant people in those roles understand more and more where we're coming from. The next one then is the proactive involvement of local fire officers in new projects, right from design stage, to encourage more of a partnership approach. At the moment, it's very much a culture of the fire safety services. The design team includes a fire consultant, the fire safety cert application is submitted prior to kicking off with the work. More often than not, there's particularly on bigger jobs, as I mentioned earlier, there's a change or multiple changes made, and therefore one or more revisions to the fire cert are submitted throughout the life of the project, of the actual construction project. And there's always a little bit of cat and mouse about the whole thing from our point of view, as far as we can see. And as I said, it again, from the point of view of living with the building and minding and managing the building for its lifetime, that even that process can make life very difficult, because, as I said earlier, you're after the fact, you're trying to figure out, well, why was that changed from this to that, and where is that documented, and how does that work now? And worst case is that the changes that were made were submitted in to get a fire safety cert, but ultimately there were consequential effects that weren't considered as part of those changes. Next one then is there's a term that's well understood in the facilities management industry called soft landings, and that is it's a whole ethos and a set of principles regarding the handover of projects from the construction team to the facilities people, and it's an ongoing, I suppose, an ongoing battle. It's some projects are better than others, but it's hoping that by everybody sticking with those principles and following them right through, which primarily starts with involving the facility people right from day one, it makes for the whole process of managing that building much more effective and much easier. And also that again, back to David's point earlier, that there's a really strong understanding of the fire safety design intent for the building from day one. So silly questions aren't being asked, and at the same time, right from day one, the building is being looked after in, as I said, with in line with the intention that it was designed as. Next one then, clearly defined responsibilities. This is obviously a point that will be covered later in the code of practice, and just regarding fire risk assessments, and the full scope, I suppose, within those, including penalties for non-compliance. At the moment, being honest, there's a lot of confusion, I think, out there regarding what exactly is required, regarding what does the fire risk assessment consist of, and obviously the whole piece around competency. And that brings me on to the next piece nicely, which is having clearly defined competencies for those fire risk assessors, the specialists, the people that we engage, the likes of Claire, who you'll hear from next, to come in and actually and essentially take a full overview as a fire specialist of the building and all of the various components that are contributing to that. We believe that really the only way to do this is that a national body needs to be established to educate and promote fire risk assessments overall to the public, to building owners, but also to manage a registration scheme for competent persons. Exactly the same as we all know about the process of getting a BER assessor from the SEAI list. There's another one for refrigeration, where you have to use an approved contractor that's on the F-Gas Ireland register, RECCE for electricians, RGII for boilers, and PSA, which is the Private Security Authority, for licensed security providers. It sort of seems very strange that there are two on that alone that are environmental and driven by the environment, and it's well established and are well established, but yet something like this, which is simply life safety, and there isn't a structure equivalent to that. So basically, it's all about self-declaration and for all nearly self-assessment. Next one is sort of a simple one, but that is to ensure that all inspecting authorities are aligned regarding guidance, enforcement, language, that the terminology that's used, i.e. fire authorities, HICWA, HSA, and TUSLA primarily. We have a certain amount of crossover with them all. We're glad to say we've never had the wrath of any fire authority on us regarding any of our clients, but we've certainly had dealings with fire authorities and HICWA, the HSA, and TUSLA. So we're well aware of it, and we certainly would see that there are gaps there or differences of opinions of how things should be done and the processes to be followed. So I suppose in summary, what I'm suggesting is that there should be clear guidelines that really can be applied to all occupied buildings on what must be done, how to do it, when it must be done, why it must be done. And just to wrap it up, just to say, look, you know, BCAR was brought in because of issues around safe reason. You know, let's just try and avoid that same mistake again and avoid self-interpretation, self-regulation again. Okay, thanks.
Super, Air. Thank you very much. That really was quite comprehensive. I do recall you saying you would do it in 5 minutes. I never believed it then, and I proved correctly. We're now going to move on to Claire, who's going to, I think Air has introduced Claire sufficiently. I'm going to move the time on and let her introduce herself from this point. Claire, over to you.
Hi all. So I'm a chartered engineer, and I would consider myself to be both a specialist in fire safety and in health and safety. So to me, I suppose this topic is particularly interesting because when we talk about fire safety in occupied buildings, you can kind of approach it from both the fire regulation side of things, but also the health and safety side of things. So that's really what the core of my slides today were, to just kind of ground this conversation in some guidelines, some guidance, and maybe just put a sense of what I believe sets the tone for why we need to do fire risk assessments. So to start with, I suppose I just wanted to talk about, and AIR's most definitely referred to it indirectly in lots of different ways, but any building built since 1992 would have a fire safety certificate. That fire safety certificate would set out how the building was intended to be designed to comply with the building regulations that were applicable at the time. So if you have a building, occupy a building that's been built since that, there is a fire safety certificate for your building. And that fire safety certificate would have a compliance report setting out how it complies with the building regs, and it would have drawings that show on drawings, you know, which of the walls are compartment walls, which doors are fire doors, what the rating of those walls and doors are, etc. But I think it's really interesting to note that Tech and Guidance Document B, which obviously is the guidance that you're meeting when you submit your fire safety certificate, it actually categorically states that the guidance contained in the document has been based on the assumption that there will be an adequate level of fire safety management when the building is used. So it's the Tech and Guidance Document B is working on the basis that whatever you've set out as your means of compliance with that document, that would be managed on an ongoing basis. And it also, in that same section, refers to active fire safety systems. By that we would mean the emergency lighting and the fire alarm system, AOVs, that kind of stuff that responds to an actual fire incident, that they should be managed during the life of the building. And passive systems, which are our walls and our doors, fundamentally, they need to be maintained so that they don't deteriorate over the life of the building. So the building regulations, which creates the environment where a fire safety certificate is granted, does in effect say that we need to manage and maintain what was set out in our fire safety certificate for the life of the building. So then moving on to the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act, which surprises me sometimes that people seem to be more familiar and more comfortable with. It applies obviously to all workplaces, so anywhere that is considered a workplace, even if the workplace doesn't have actual employees working in it consistently. So I would often use the example of a residential apartment development, that the common areas of a residential apartment development have to comply with the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act, even though there wouldn't be ongoing employees there, but contractors come in to do maintenance, to do cleaning, whatever. So it is considered a workplace at times in its life, so therefore it should comply with the Act. The Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act specifically says that you need to do a risk assessments, and that those risk assessments should take account of the general principles of prevention. And it says that those risk assessments should be based on the identification of hazards. So I mean, it seems like a no-brainer to me that fire safety is a hazard that would affect anybody at a workplace. So therefore we should, as based on the Safety, Health and Welfare Work Act, have a risk assessment focusing specifically on fire safety. And it also goes on to say that the employer must take steps to implement any improvements considered necessary on foot of those risk assessments. So that's the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act. So I mean, that obviously applies regardless of what age your building is, regardless of how complex your building is. If you need a safety statement, if you have employees either working permanently or temporarily on occasion in your workplace, then you should have, as far as I'm concerned, a risk assessment that focuses on fire safety, and you should implement any controls that fire risk assessment deems necessary. If we move on to talk about the Fire Services Act, and I'm conscious that John will probably talk about this in more detail, but the Fire Services Act is applicable to all premises apart from the private family home. It applies to residential, multi-occupied residential premises, but just not your own door family house. The Fire Services Act sets out what's deemed a potentially dangerous building. And obviously, again, it doesn't seem to be a complicated concept that you're going to try and prevent your building from being labelled or described as a potentially dangerous building. So in order to do that, you're going to try and make sure that you have adequate means of egress from the building, or that you're going to have adequate appliances or fittings for the automatic detection of fire and warning to persons. So that's fire detection alarm system, or adequate appliances for emergency lighting, which is obviously your emergency lighting system. So if you are the controller or organizer of occupier of a premises, and the Fire Services Act applies to you, which it will by default, unless you're a private family home, you have to ensure, in order to prevent yourself from being labelled as a potentially dangerous building under the Fire Services Act, you have to ensure that you have adequate means of escape, a fire detection alarm system, and emergency lighting. That's just picking three of the most crucial examples. So from my perspective as a fire safety and health and safety consultant, how would you, as the employer, as the occupant, as the builder, as the owner of a building, how would you assess your compliance with the original fire safety certificate that was granted before construction, if you're a post-1992 building? So how would you assess that after the fact, 10 or 15 years later, as is often the case for me? How would you assess whether or not you're actually still complying with your fire safety cert that was granted before you constructed? How would you assess whether or not you're meeting your obligations under the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act in terms of conducting a risk assessment and managing the hazards that are in your premises? And how would you assess your compliance under the Fire Services Act? So to me, when there's lots of debate and people get all caught up in where does it say we need a fire cert, if we step back from that and say, I don't know how you as an owner or as an occupier, as an FM consultant working on behalf of clients, how you could confirm to your board of directors or your CEO, how you could confirm that your building is meeting its obligations under the Fire Services Act or the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act or your original fire cert if you don't actually assess it. So that to me is the grounds and the basis for a fire safety assessment. We can call it a fire safety assessment, a fire risk assessment, a fire safety audit. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's just the person with technical competence, like myself, coming into the building, gathering all the documentation that you have, including your original fire cert, and then asking them, walking around and assessing and doing some opening up works to establish, have you got what you should have, and are you meeting the obligations that are set out? So the fire risk assessment will ensure that you are meeting your fire safety obligations through your fire safety procedures, your measures, your precautions, and making sure that that's captured. But more importantly than that, not just to measure what you're currently doing, but also to tell you what you need to do further. Because in my 18 years working in fire safety at this stage, I don't think I've got into a building that hasn't required some further work. Some buildings require significant further work to meet the obligations under the Act. So that's the purpose of the fire risk assessment is in general, unfortunately, based on the building stock we have, is going to identify what your programme of works might be over the next year, over the next 3 years, possibly even over the next 5 or 6 years, depending on the scale of the workload, so that you can start improving and moving towards compliance with that legislation. That's me, David. Nice and quick.
Thanks, Claire. I really think that between yourself and Air, you've really covered the built environment very, very well. And you've asked a lot of questions between the two of you. We'll move on to Sean now from Dublin Fire Brigade, Senior Executive Fire Prevention Officer, who is tasked with enforcement. Is it the big stick approach, Sean, or do you speak nicely to people, and should people be afraid of you? Maybe we leave those questions for a little bit later and let you introduce yourself and move on.
Thanks, David. It's great to see a great turnout here this afternoon. I see it on the participants list here. So yeah, it's great to see a good turnout on an important subject, I suppose, and a subject that we deal with a lot in terms of, I suppose, the fire safety assessments under enforcement within Dublin Fire Brigade. I suppose just to give a brief background from my own perspective, I'm a senior executive fire prevention officer within the fire prevention section in Dublin Fire Brigade. And my background, I suppose, in terms of career, I've got a master's in fire safety engineering from University of Ulster. And from there, I suppose, I've been a fire safety consultant in both the UK and Ireland, where I've worked on projects, I suppose, in Ireland, UK, mainland Europe, Iraq, United Arab Emirates, and the likes. And I suppose since 2017, I've moved from, I suppose, the private sector into what is now the public sector with Dublin Fire Brigade. And since then, I've had a bit of, I suppose, experience in working with Kildare Fire Service as well as Assistant Chief Fire Officer, and most recently returning back to Dublin Fire Brigade as Senior Executive Fire Prevention Officer. I suppose to give an overview before we get into, I suppose, the fire safety assessments and I suppose the topic that I wanted to discuss today, I suppose, and then David approached me on it to give our views on it. To give an overview of the section, there's approximately 30 odd fire prevention officers within the section, and it's a ranked structure. And we, I suppose, we cover the functional areas, that being Dublin City Council, Dunleary Rathdown County Council, Fingal County Council, and South Dublin County Council. I suppose, and the role and I suppose the responsibilities we have are primarily based around the implementation of the Building Control Act and also the Fire Services Act. And I suppose under the Fire Services Act, which is one of the reasons we're here today, is to discuss, I suppose, how we, I suppose, proceed with enforcements. We do inspections, we issue warning letters, we issue fire safety notices, closure notices, we go down prosecution route, and also in some cases we end up going down the High Court route within enforcement. We deal with referrals from the public, I suppose referrals with regards to non-compliance issues, maybe within the general public buildings. Doors being blocked, maybe doors in nightclubs being blocked, or shopping centres, or whatever it may be. We deal with planning. We look at planning applications. We get into high level discussions on planning under the Fire Services Act. We deal with environmental health referrals. We deal with TUSLA and again public representatives as well with regard to maybe referrals of issues that are found within the Dublin region. We also deal with, I suppose, major event licensing, and we deal with the Marley Parks, the Phoenix Park, and again St Patrick's Day Parade is an example. We also go through a process of the licensing applications and assessment of dangerous substance licensing, that being petroleum and explosives. We look at fireworks, pyrotechnics around the New Year, various different festivals. And a new thing that has come to play of recent times as a result of the current pandemic is street furniture, and we're having a lot of, I suppose, streets throughout the Dublin area that are now, I suppose, the likes of the restaurants and so on, and the publicans of this world looking at expanding their internal area out to the external street area. And again, it's an interesting area that we look at in terms of street furniture, ensuring there's means of escape available from the various retail units and restaurants along the street, that there's fire brigade access available that would have been utilised or may have been utilised as an access route to various buildings along that street. We're very proactive in our community fire safety. We engage a lot with the community. We do a lot of projects, I suppose, with schools and so on, as an example. Special projects, I guess, again, we're involved in a lot of major infrastructural projects, and maybe one of that's currently under review at the minute is the proposed new Metrolink, which will be going from North County Dublin to the south of the city. That's under review at the minute. And again, a lot of our colleagues, I suppose, within Dublin Fire Brigade, we engage in national committees for standards development. We're involved in steering committee groups with the review of the current technical guidance document. We advise on the NSAI on fire detection alarm system, emergency lighting, and so on, the various standards that are associated with that. So that sort of gives a brief overview, I guess, of what we do in fire prevention in a brief synopsis. To move on to, I suppose, the main area that I suppose when David approached me, he asked me, he says, Sean, he says, you've got experience in both sides of the sector here in terms of the private industry, but also the public sector. And he says, what are your views now in terms of where having experienced both? And I suppose today, for the purpose of my presentation, it's broadly based on my role from a DFB perspective. And I suppose as a fire officer within Dublin Fire Brigade, we have the powers under the Fire Services Act under 18.6, I suppose, to request that the person having a control over a premises to which, I suppose, the Fire Services Act applies to carry out a fire safety assessment of the premises and notify ourselves or the local fire authorities of the assessment, but also to carry out work specified under that, so that I suppose to make good, for want of a better term, and again to provide an outline of time frame as to how long the works will be taken if deficiencies were found. So to give I suppose again, it's a short and brief synopsis of our experiences over the years. We issue, I suppose, under the enforcement regime under the Fire Services Act, we issue letters where we request fire safety assessments be undertaken under 18.6. And over the years, we've experienced a large variation in detail, I suppose, in terms of quality, the information within. I suppose there's a general lack of understanding of what is required as part of a fire safety assessment. There's an issue there in terms of, we believe, in technical knowledge and I suppose the skill set and experience required to undertake that, you know. And I think this is where we're looking at today is a step in the right direction from a code of practice being developed here, and the information contained within can only help matters and move things forward, you know. In a lot of cases we have, I suppose, where we request fire safety assessments, a lot of these buildings may have been subject to previously approved fire safety certificate applications, but on receipt of the fire safety assessment, there's no acknowledgement, no reference of any previously approved fire cert, you know, and that essentially is the basis of compliance for the building. And I suppose, as Claire alluded to earlier, the fire cert process came into play in 1992. So I'm sort of speaking here in terms of post 1992, where we do have previously approved fire certs. Where we have, I suppose, requested fire safety assessments pre-1992, which wouldn't be subject to the fire cert process, again, I suppose there's a lack of understanding there of what the building should comply with. You know, for example, maybe a residential use. What guidance is out there to comply with the in terms of flats and maisonettes and so on, you know? So there is guidance out there, and we'd recommend, I suppose, it comes down to the competency of the personnel or the engineer, consultant, advisor, architect, whatever it may be, is to having a broad knowledge of what is required and what should be submitted to ourselves. And that, I suppose, eases the process from an enforcement perspective, you know, and to show a level of proactiveness is key, you know. What we often find as well is a lack of interim mitigation measures on foot off, I suppose, finding a series of non-compliances and issues. And that has been an issue for ourselves, and that there's no proposal or lack of proposals and what will be the mitigation measures, because a lot of these buildings, you must remember, are occupied buildings, you know. So what measures are going to be put in place when this building is being occupied? Another key element to I suppose, a robust fire safety assessment, and an issue that we've had over the past as well, is the lack of specific timeframes for remedial works. You know, I think the assessors out there need to be very upfront with us in terms of what are the realistic timeframes. And I suppose as an organisation, Dublin Fire Brigade are amenable to reasonable timeframes, you know, but we need to look at the risk, and that's where the assessor has to come into play here as well, in assessing the risk, assessing the occupation, the type of occupation, the type of personnel, I guess, the demographics of the building and the personnel within as well. And often an issue that we find as well is that, I suppose, whilst all the various proposals are put in place, we generally go and inspect on foot off the works that's been undertaken, and in some cases we're advised by the fire consultant that the works have now been completed. In a lot of cases where we're struggling to receive an opinion of compliance on the works, And that is key as well. Whilst a risk assessment is undertaken and the works are being undertaken to comply with it, it's important that the end user gets an opinion of compliance to provide him a level of satisfaction and comfort that the building complies with building regulations. But there's also, I suppose, one more point I want to make as well is, and I know, David, you're holding us to the 5-minute rule here. In a lot of cases, we're finding, I suppose, on post completion of the works, and as part of our own enforcement cases, we go back out and visit these various buildings that are out there on foot of previous enforcement. And whilst all the good work may have been undertaken previously 2-3 years beforehand, we're going back to the same old buildings again and finding repeat issues. And I think the question that raises is there, I suppose, a lack of knowledge to the end user of their responsibilities, of knowing what a fire door is or what a firewall is, I suppose. And what we do find is for example, a typical firewall might have punctures with cabling or ductwork or whatever it may be, and hasn't been made good and ensured that wall provides the required fire resistance it is required to provide, So that's I suppose a synopsis of the issues that we've had over the years in terms of the 18.6 risk assessment request, and in terms of what we receive to in terms of our assessment of them, And I think this is only a move in the right direction. So, David, I think that's a brief synopsis of where we're at in terms of from a DFB perspective, and I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Sean. Again, very comprehensive, and I mentioned at the very beginning that managing fire safety in all its forms is complex. It's the same issues around the world. And I also mentioned there that we've taken a step forward, and I applaud Chris and his colleagues in creating the Building Control Amendment Regulations, which came into being in the 1st of March 2014. Air certainly referenced that. And I think we've taken a step forward. I don't know how many times post-Grenfell and through the various questions and soul searching that's been going on in the UK, I've been asked, explain BCAR to me. Is there an idiot's guide to BCAR you can provide? So full marks, Chris, from that point of view. As I said again in the introduction, John mentioned that you were planning to build on that success, and I think we're seeing the first step on that road today. When you've added new guidance with a specific intent, and I look forward to hearing what you've got to say at this point. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, David. I'm afraid I can't take any credit for the development of BCAR. It was entirely my colleagues in the building standards section were associated with them, so I must give them full credit for all of that work. But thanks for trying to associate me with them anyway. But I can't. I have to put my hand up on that one. Good afternoon, everybody, and it's great to be here. And thank you for your invite, and from the IFE and from David, and it's very interesting to hear the previous speakers and their views on the various issues we're talking about today. My name is Chris Barry. I work with the National Directorate for Fire and Emergency Management, which is a section of the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, and I'm a fire advisor, an assistant fire advisor with the department, and have been for the last number of years. I suppose my background is previously within the department. I was a housing inspector, so I concur with my previous speakers. The sometimes alarming number of defects one might find in buildings, and even buildings just completed. So yeah, it's certainly something that's very close to my own heart, if you like, with respect to the safety of buildings, both new and old. So yeah, certainly that's something we'll try and deal with I intend to try and cover a number of topics, and I'm alarmed at the 5-minute rule, but I'll do my best anyway. And we'll try and get through just some of these high-level topics. As I said, previous speakers have covered some of the area, and I won't dwell too deeply on them. I don't want to be quoting legislation at you for the afternoon. I'm sure you don't want that either. But I'm generally just going to talk about the National Directorate for Fire and Emergency Management, what it does and its purpose, a general reference to the Fire Services Act, discuss briefly the work of the Fire Safety Task Force and the Fire Safety in Ireland report that followed from it, issues surrounding codes of practice development, and highlight the draft code of practice for fire safety assessment of premises and buildings, and talk to you quickly about the public consultation, which has just begun today, as things would have happened, and you'll be able to access that document on our departmental website, and I'll give you links to that later on. So that's fortuitous in many ways. As I said, we're a section within the National Directorate, is a section within the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, and I suppose we're set up, if you like, to take on all departmental roles, including Oireachtas issues policy, a local government, lead government department role for 7 emergency scenarios, including severe weather. You might have seen some of my colleagues leading that over the last number of years, Storm, Emma and all the rest of it, the sterling work they do in that section of our department. We liaise between Met Éireann and the local severe weather assessment team, and we're the body for the Central National Training Programme for Fire Services, and we oversee the Fire Services Capital Programme. There's over 215, I think, fire stations around the country, and development of those is central to what we do. The 31 authorities that we look after are liaised with, and we provide national guidance and national standards, which is development of, as was mentioned, the current revision of Technical Guidance Document B, which is an ongoing project, which to date has produced a document from 2017, dwelling houses, and also an associated document, community dwelling houses as well. So that we divided the document into 2 parts to deal with the simpler part of domestic dwellings and the more complex other buildings other than dwellings, which we hope to, in the due course, to bring forward again for a public consultation. And again, we are also involved in communications, national network for call networks, and indeed legislative review. And that legislative review includes the review of the Fire Services Act. And again, just getting to that, I suppose it's important to remember the Fire Services Act is 40 years in place. And I think we should note the very sad, tragic anniversary that we had over the Valentine's weekend of the Stardust tragedy, in which 48 young people sadly lost their lives. And it's certainly something that plays within us, I think, and anyone involved in fire safety. And we sadly have seen subsequent events both here and in other countries where there has been loss of life. And I think that always serves to bring to the fore why we do what we do, I suppose, and the purpose of the Act as we would see it. And I suppose it's for me to say the Fire Services Act is there, and anybody involved in buildings or in the management of buildings should be aware of their statutory responsibilities. They're serious, they're ongoing, and can incur significant penalties and sanctions. So it is the law of the land. Sadly, I have to tell you that, and you need to be aware of that, and notwithstanding any other responsibilities, these are onerous and these are serious and these are quite comprehensive, and it gives to the local authority as authorised fire officer a range of options in dealing with that. And it was mentioned the fire safety assessments and the other sanctions that can be brought forward, fire safety notice, closure notice, or a high court order. So it's they are and our local authority fire officers take on board those responsibilities and activate those when appropriate. But I think it's important to note that if you're involved in building management, or if you have responsibility for, you may indeed find yourself with those level of responsibilities, and it's something that you can't actually ignore. So, and again, I think this part of this process as well is to help raise awareness, and it was mentioned, I think, by Claire about people's awareness of the Safety, Health and Welfare Work Act. Certainly, it's our intention to bring to the fore the requirements and your responsibilities under the Fire Services Act, as stated. So I suppose I won't go any further into that, but we will talk perhaps specifically about the assessment issue. Going back to the whole issue of fire safety assessments, and again another tragic event that brought us to here, I suppose. The Fire Safety Task Force set up subsequent to the tragic Grenfell fire in London in 2017, and this very sad, significant loss of life that was resulted from that, and indeed. The task force was set up by the minister, and indeed that task force convened and set up and made a number of recommendations. Those recommendations were taken on board by a fire safety subcommittee, which was set up again by the National Directorate, invoking a number of different stakeholders to put flesh, if you like, on those recommendations, and a number of those recommendations dealt with and suggested development of guides and codes of practices, which I became, I suppose, centrally involved in with a number of our colleagues from the various local authorities. A specific fire safety subgroup was set up, which I chaired, and which had input from, as I said, the fire officers from the various local authorities, and we have been developing a number of documents since then. So, and there are, it was mentioned, a number of existing codes of practice for flats and places of assembly, etc., and they're long-standing and may still have some use. We have proposed codes of practice in development. The one I mentioned today is the code of practice for the fire safety assessment of premises and buildings, which has just been put on our departmental website, and it's available for the next month for public comment and for your recommendations, and certainly we'll be delighted to hear, and I'm delighted to be able to announce that here today, given the nature and the construction of the audience that's here. So I think it's timely, and we certainly look forward to hearing from you any comments that you might have to make on that. And we are making further guides, which we hope to bring forward again over the coming period, addressing specifically the responsibilities and duties of the persons having control. It was mentioned earlier there, your duties under that under Section 18 of the Act. So certainly we'll be developing that, and other guides that we may be bringing forward are specifically on the management of apartment buildings and development of training for owner management companies. So there's, if you like, a suite of new documents which we hope will complement each other and hope will assist in giving advice and giving good guidance as to what might be required under the various headings and under the various recommendations of the task force report. You can see it here. This is the draft code of practice for fire safety assessment in premises and buildings, and I suppose this document. Again, I won't go through it in detail, but it covers a lot of issues. The aim of it is to, I suppose, to give a cohesive and a coherent and level of investigation and assessment of buildings. We hear, indeed, from Sean and from Claire, perhaps of documentation or indeed lack of documentation. What we're hoping to achieve here is that a level, when an assessment is requested, that a level of information will be supplied on foot of that assessment that will adequately reflect the nature and any defects that are of note and any actions required to address those defects in the building. So there'll be issues regarding, firstly, I suppose, the competence, I suppose, or qualifications, as we would see it, of the persons carrying out such an assessment. And we would suggest in the body of the document that it would be a registered architect, chartered building surveyors, etc., chartered engineers on the register maintained by Engineers Ireland, and members of the Institute of Fire Engineers who hold the title of chartered engineers. So those, if you like, are the types of backgrounds and qualifications that we would see as being suitable for the carrying out and of such an assessment, I suppose. And the whole issue of the contents of the report is certainly essential to it, and we have there's a significant amount in the document about that. The scale and the scope of the required assessment, the complexity and scale of the building, the use of the building, the age of the building, all of those. And indeed, I suppose we set out that if you are doing a building assessment, you're going to have to go into that building and assess it. We've heard where people, in some cases, perhaps might have used some class of desktop study or documentation review, etc. It's critical and central to the whole purpose of the assessment to understand the building from first principles, and indeed to gather the required information or the information that may be available from fire safety certificates, from construction drawings, from planning and other types of information, and indeed all the other information that required with respect to the installations of the buildings was mentioned, the fire detection alarm systems, emergency lighting systems, etc., and any other systems that might be in the building, and any other associated facilities that might be associated with the call and response of the fire detection and alarm system. So all of that, I think, is important. And in our section 3.7, we have issues on the contents of the survey and how that might be achieved, the areas that you might would be most useful to address, the existing fire safety provisions, the recommendations in respect of any remedial works, the recommendations for prioritising and programming any works that might be required, and the measures to be implemented or conditions to be observed in using the premises, maximum occupants, etc. So, and I suppose in relation to the remedial works, that's again central to the whole issue of the document regarding the scale of those works and the priority of those works. And indeed, in the appendix to the document, there is such a risk, if you like, matrix document, which helps to set out and understand from first principles, I suppose, how you might action that type of work for yourself. So again, we're hoping that this will give a bit of consistency and give the required information, rather than just, if you like, a one-page document that we've often heard some people suggest have been given, and bring a bit of consistency and depth and range and scope that's required for the assessment, and indeed be clear as to any of the recommendations, any works that may be required, and indeed, as Sean set out, the timeline for those works, the priority for those works, and so on and so forth. So certainly that's as I said, the document is now available on our departmental website, and the process is 4 weeks, so until the end of the month you have until to submit comments, and we welcome all of your inputs, and indeed we'll fully consider those, indeed, so that any amendments we might make will be timely and appropriate. So you can see the link there to the actual document itself, and indeed that's the document, and there's the the address to send in your comments, fire safety public consultation at housing.gov.ie. And as I said, we await your comments, and we certainly hope we're all in the same business of ensuring safety in buildings and the safety of persons in buildings. And so we hope this is another step towards that. And as I said, over the next number of months, we hope to bring forward a number of additional documents, and in due course, we'll be bringing forward a draft technical guidance document, B, Volume 1, Buildings Other than Dwelling Houses. And again, we hope and anticipate your involvement in that. And so again, I'd ask you to take note of this address, and indeed to make comment if you see fit. So thank you very much indeed. I'll leave it at that for the moment. So thank you, David.
Thank you, Chris, and apologies for giving you credit where you don't feel it's due. But from my perspective, I'm seeing a department that is working in a positive direction, and you're part of a team. So please take the credit.
I'll pass it on to my colleague.
What I'm also seeing here is that a more cohesive approach being taken from the department through the enforcement authorities within Dublin Fire Brigade, through the people who are actually managing buildings and dealing with clients. Just before we move on, normally speaking, at this stage, I would be standing in a room with a crowd of people. I don't know, do we have 50 people or so present, or is it more?
87, I think.
87 people. Well, to those 87, can I say, I would normally be asking you, how have we done so far? Are you seeing the answers to the questions you came to ask? And maybe you can use the chat function to throw a few more questions at the panel. I want to start off with going back to the basics, and possibly best directed to Air and to Claire, but really to the panel as a whole. Do building owners and operators understand the responsibility under the Fire Services Act? Do they actually? To me, it's a badly named act insofar as the Fire Services Act. That's for the fire services. What does that have to do with me as a owner of a building? But that's obviously that is clearly the area. But do people actually understand? Is that your do you have to explain that to people, and how difficult a job is that? Air, maybe first. You'll have to unmute yourself first there before you can speak. The simplest answer is no. I don't think so. I think it's understood, and Claire touched on it earlier regarding the general regulations, safety regulations. I think it's seen as what is understood is that there's a requirement there, particularly, I guess, specifically to those as a workplace, that it is understood as an extension of that. But I don't think beyond that, to answer your question, that it is understood that the Fire Services Act is known about or understood particularly well. Okay, well, if we've achieved anything today, is to explain that it is very relevant to people. Claire, have you got something to add to that one?
Yeah, well, I suppose my response would be kind of unusual in the sense, or not unusual, but would be relevant to the fact that if they've contacted me, their chances are they're aware of something. So if they've come to me, they have a sense that they need to, take care of their business, and they're looking for that advice. So I would tend to attract, I suppose, the kind of clients that are already conscious of maybe not specifically the Fire Services Act, but at least their obligation to have a building that's safe from fire. What I would probably say is move the question on a little bit further, which is when they do ask me the question in relation to their fire safety compliance, what do they think they're asking? What do they think the question they're asking is? And so quite often the question they're asking is much simpler than what they should be asking. So they're asking me, is my fire alarm system being serviced properly? Like, are my fire doors all right? Should I have a better evacuation plan? Or, it's kind of fairly soft stuff. I think that there's very few building owners or people responsible for buildings that get the fact that our building stock has been constructed so poorly that they cannot make an assumption that their building is compliant with the original fire safety certificate. I mean, as I've said, I've probably done work in 100+ buildings, all occupied, all full of people, in the last 15 years, and I have not found major holes. Every single building I go to has major penetrations that haven't been, sealed, has a fire alarm system that doesn't actually cover all the areas it should, that has AOVs that people don't even know need to be serviced, dampers that people don't even know need to be serviced. So it's one thing to know about the Fire Services Act, but it's another thing to actually understand the onerousness of your obligations to maintain and manage your building as per day one. And if you don't know what day one was, how can you know you're meeting that obligation? That's what I'd have to say.
You've mentioned the fire safety certificate process there, and Air certainly mentioned it in his initial presentation. How well is that process understood, and do people actually understand what the design strategy of their building is? I think, Sean, I may have cut you off there. You opened your mouth as I was speaking. I beg your pardon.
Yeah, no, I think from our perspective, and I think it was touched on there earlier as well, is that essentially, in our view, it's the missing link, or it's the weakest link in the chain. I suppose we've made dramatic changes in the industry in terms of the BCAR process and moved on from where we have been pre-BCAR, and we now have a process here where you have your assigned certifier and your ancillary certification process. But there's certainly a link missing there from an end user perspective. We're having strategies coming into ourselves by way of fire cert applications, where some of the strategies could be very simple, I suppose, prescriptive-based fire cert applications to the more performance-based, I suppose, fire cert application, and a lot of those are complex in ways, and that could be from maybe an open plan apartment block that has residential sprinklers to maybe a smoke control system within the common areas, and each of those has a complex cause and effect strategy built in to ensure that the building complies with the strategy, and I suppose my question would be is that, okay, whilst we've got the BCAR to a standard that is in pretty good shape, and I think you touched on it, it has its own problems as well, but I suppose the weakest part here is how that information in terms of how the strategy works in the building is handed over to the end user, to the likes of yourselves here, and you would have to ask the question, well, at what point of involvement does the end user, is there, where can we, I suppose, create a link there, and how do we create that link? And I suppose that's where I suppose we see the issue here, and it's all well and fine having complex strategies and maybe more so the simpler process of a fire cert application coming into ourselves, but once it's approved by ourselves, it's handed over to the end user, and that 110% is the missing link. So I suppose how do we improve matters from that perspective?
And to me, I'm going to add something to that I think is quite relevant, that if you talk about our large scale office buildings, of which, many of the participants would probably, work within those or represent those, that they, as the future building owners, the future building occupants, they're not at the design table. The building is often being built by a design team purely for sale. So the people sitting around the room deciding what the smoke ventilation strategy is going to be or how the escape routes are going to work are not the people who end up occupying the building at all. And I think that is, Air might come back to that, but there's some buildings I've been involved in where at the handover stage, whether it's handover, I don't necessarily mean construction handover, I mean handover from the developer to the future tenant, that handover is treated, there's almost an external engineering firm hired to ensure that what the future tenant is accepting is a building that they really understand. The building may have been built compliant with BCAR, but the future occupant doesn't actually have any idea what that is. So I think there's a danger in the construction industry that our large scale, very valuable buildings are not being built by owner occupiers. They're being built by owners for sale, and future occupiers aren't at the table at all.
I think you're absolutely right.
Claire,
sorry, just to say, I was going to say, and this is where I guess addressing those who are listening from the facility side, this is where that the importance of soft landings is, and I'm using it just as a term because it's unknown. It's a known term. It really demonstrates how important it is. It's the principle of early engagement, and the FM people who in a number of cases actually may have the option as essentially as a client rep to sit at the top table from day one. That it's not a case of, just wait until it's finished and take the keys and here we go. It's actually to proactively step in and be involved from day one, to understand it. In some cases also to influence it. Back to one of my points earlier, because as Sean, as you touched on, sometimes the design people are coming up with very, very good and very effective strategies. But the reality is that's all very well, but actually when it comes to managing the building, it's virtually impossible to implement because of just the way the building is being occupied. So it's even to be able to influence that and say, great idea, but hang on a minute, this is just not going to work for us. So we need to find a workaround here.
I think it's a key point there you make, because at the end of the day, once the strategy or the fire site application goes through ourselves, it's handed over, and Mr. Fire Consultant or Mr. Fire Safety Advisor or whatever it may be has walked off and has moved on to pastures new, and we are seeing a lot of complex strategies coming across the table as we speak, and the question we often ask, well, can this actually be managed? Will it be managed? So I think it's an area that needs to be looked at.
Is there? So you talk about the gap, Claire. I think an area you said it as well. The information that's required at commissioning and all that, and the handover of that information, as you said. I suppose the building regulations themselves and the technical guidance documents are kind of taking a hand in one sense. Even Part J and Part L have a section on user information, and indeed the proposed Part B may indeed have such a requirement as well. The requirements under the Safety, Health and Welfare and Work Act with respect to a building file and the information contained in that, is that not one of the key documents or key drivers for coalescing all of that information today?
Yes, but first of all, there's time lags. So, I mean, if you talk to most contractors, they'll tell you that you won't get the safety file for months and months after the building's occupied. Yeah. So you'll have a building already occupied, a fire alarm system already working, and no actual cause and effect if you didn't get to the fire consultant first and get him to issue the cause and effect. So there's definitely a time lag. There's also the difference, and I mean this very respectfully, the difference between, so pause for a second. I have this unusual position where I'm very rarely a design fire consultant. So I very rarely design any sort of fire safety, strategy and submit to the fire service. I spend most of my time working in occupied buildings. So as often happens to me, I could be brought into a job to a brand new build to help a tenant occupy a space, or because I happen to be working for a managing agent that's responsible for managing the tenancy in a space. And I will go look for the safety file, and I'll be given 14 boxes in a shed, in the basement to maul through, and inevitably it won't have been produced to the level of detail that I want. The kind of detail that I'm like, drawings that actually show the location of dampers. That's never going to be in a safety file. There'll be a 14-page specification for the dampers, but it won't show me where the dampers actually are inside the building unless there was an exceptional fire consultant involved and a lot of that information was handed over. I have an interesting situation where I have a client who's a housing association, a small housing association, but a housing association in the same. So they're currently buying up lots of small apartment buildings out in rural parts of Ireland, with 20 units in it, whatnot, in small towns, and inevitably the architect that's overseeing the project is a small architect that, fire safety is not something that they would have particular competence in. But my client, as the housing association, have me act as a somewhat fire safety clerk of works. So there's already a fire strategy, there's already a fire cert granted, and they're asking me to go in to make sure what's being delivered to them meets that expectation. And I think that to me is the bit. It's not just about the documentation, it's some obligation. It's almost, you know, the way in planning we say that the owner has to occupy the house for 7 years after construction. It's almost like as if the design team, particularly the fire consultant and the design team, should be forced to engage after the fact with an equivalent fire consultant on the owner's side. You know, so that I should be getting phone calls saying, can you come in and act for the fire consultant and receive a building for us? And I should be expected to sit down with another fire consultant and say, why did you do this? Why did you do that? Mark up more drawings for me, or me mark up the drawings myself there and then in the moment. So it's way too life critical to be relying on a box of stuff put together by a PSDP who, you know, in reality doesn't fire safety is one of a multitude of things he's thinking about. I think we need to actually, that strand needs to be, you know, that fire certs are almost granted with the obligation that the especially for the more complex buildings, and by complex I even mean residential complex, because some of those are moved into just a lot of systems in them, that they should be forced to hand over to an equivalent fire consultant acting on behalf of the new owner or the new managing agent, so we can translate it for that occupant and leave them with something they understand.
But I think you're right there. Sorry. Yeah. One of the things I think that and I know David mentioned this before at various conferences. There is a belief in the construction industry that the O&Ms, the safety files, whatever you want to call them, that they are at best going to sit somewhere and gather dust, if at all. Ultimately, that it's quite possible that nobody will ever look at them again. They'll end up in the bin at some stage. That's the view that the industry has of of handing paperwork over. So from that point of view, as Claire mentioned there, you know, actually getting into the detail. Funny enough, Claire mentioned about you mentioned about dampers. Of course, what we found is we have a very sort of strong methodology that when we take over a site, we do a very sort of diligent review of those files to make sure that everything that we need, that we know is going to be needed, is in there. But funny enough, a lot of the times, for example, with dampers, you get the brochures stuck in there, and they're not even the dampers that have been put in the building.
I think if you I think if you even think of, I suppose, the BCAR regime, and we're chatting about the BCAR regime here in terms of the I suppose the thoroughness of from a design perspective and an on-site perspective. Now, in a lot of cases, and it's more so maybe to the larger projects out there, there's a level of due diligence now being undertaken on a lot of these larger schemes under the BCAR process. So the focus is on reviewing the design post-approvals. Okay, so you have two consultants on board. You might have a consultant on board on behalf of the landlord, but then you have a consultant doing a due diligence on behalf of the tenant. So each of them are, I suppose, the tenant consultant is reviewing the landlord's consultant on-site sign-off perspective. But once the due diligence is finalised and all the issues have been ironed out, again, it's moving away from that. There's no discussion being held with, okay, well, we have now full knowledge of how the building operates, and we've assessed how the fire consultant has signed off on the building. But at that moment in time, we should be expecting that the consultant on behalf of the tenant would sit down at that stage and say, okay, now we have a holistic and intimate knowledge of how the building works. We're now going to look at how you manage your building moving on from here. But that doesn't happen. You know, it's purely focused on the BCAR. Has the fire damper been installed correctly? Has the fire door been installed correctly? And various bits and pieces like that. But nothing is translated across to the management element of it, you know.
But Sean, surely isn't it the case?
Chris is trying to get in there.
The issue, what I'm trying to understand is there is legislation there at the moment. There's health and safety legislation. There's a requirement for a requirement. This is not an option. This is a legislative requirement for a safety file. If people aren't providing it, that perhaps they're being remiss in their responsibilities. There's a requirement as a manager to keep a building safe and to understand it. These are requirements. These are not options that people may or may not dip into. And I'm afraid I have to point out, this is the law. If people are taking a laissez-faire attitude towards it. The development of BCAR certainly is significant, I think. There's, as you said, there is that assessment and sign-off and witnessing and commissioning of various elements to understand that what's being put in the building is designed and is functioning as designed. And that's so critical in respect to exhaust systems and what have you. There's also the development, I suppose, of BIM and the ability not to have boxes of information, but to have a file of information that's easily collated, that can be reduced to its legal requirements under the safety file legislation and passed on to the person having control. And that issue of who's the person having control, I suppose, is something we'll be grappling with and have, in our further guidance document. And we're trying to again assist people who are involved in buildings at various degrees, from the caretaker to the senior facilities manager looking after an estate, that they are the person responsibility today, and they hold it. And the further development, I think, of professional FM structures and facility management professionals, I think, is certainly a significant factor in, again, adding to those elements that will ensure that buildings are safe. But I have to come back. There's existing legislation there. You must adhere to it, and if you don't adhere to it, there are sanctions available, and that is the sad truth for lots of people, I'm afraid.
And I just wanted to put another practical element, because when I'm trying to convince or encourage clients to spend the money and do the work that needs to be necessary, you'll use any option available to try to encourage. And of course, legislation is there, and of course, the legislation should be sufficient to motivate works to be done. But in reality, there's another component which none of us here are going to formally talk about because it's not our speciality, but your building insurer is expecting you to maintain your building to a certain standard. Your building insurer is expecting that the fire alarm system is serviced, that it's covering all the areas that your certification is for, that you've maintained, that, as I would often find, you get your quarterly fire alarm maintenance done, you get a list as long as your arm of problems with your fire alarm system, and nobody actually ever executes any of those required actions. So slowly over year after year, your fire alarm system becomes less and less effective because more and more devices are faulting or more and more problems are arising. If you have a smoke ventilation system that's not working and you end up with damage beyond the area it should have started in, I mean, I doubt very much you're going to have the cover that you expect, particularly passive fire protection. I mean, if you're in a building with an adjoining neighbour, two tenants sharing an office building, and your fire spreads from your unit to your adjoining unit, your neighbours, and they sue you for fire spread through the holes that you put in when you were putting new fiber optic cable in, like, your insurance is not going to cover that. So that's not the politically correct thing to say, because we should all care about the legislation. But if you're not paying attention to your fire safety obligations, I beg you to go and have a conversation with your broker and find out fairly quickly that your broker is assuming that you're doing such. Your tires are not supposed to be bald when you drive a car, and if your insurer finds out they won't insure you for the accident. So what is the assumptions in terms of maintenance from your insurance broker, and start there at least as your in terms of what you do next.
I think though, and it goes back to what I was talking about earlier. As you said, this is a complex beast in most buildings, and until we have a way of making it very clear, I suppose it's about those of us in the facilities management, property management game, and all that. I suppose knowing what we don't know, and therefore knowing how to fix that by means of bringing in specialists who are truly competent to help us to do that. I think that we're going to struggle, and I think I mean, even Chris, I'm afraid I think that the broad brush in terms of qualification, I have to say a question. I think there's a lot more to it than that. I with all respect to architects. Yeah. There are very few architects that I would say, certainly in terms of the buildings that we're dealing with, that would be competent and knowledgeable enough to be able to do this as an exercise in any of these buildings. So I think there probably needs to be something stronger there to define the competency and as much as anything else, so that it's virtually, for using an old school term, it's virtually to be able to for building owners and occupiers to look up a golden pages of competent people right from the start. I mentioned to BCAR assessors and equivalent to a system like that it's a list of approved people who are truly competent that can then be engaged, and let the market work itself out in terms of pricing and all that sort of stuff. But the point is, at least you got a starting point for them. You know.
I'm just going to commit. I was just going to come in with
if you'd like to
something
make a detailed submission to us, I'd be happy to see it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's
I was just going to make.
Go on, Sarah.
Well, no, because I was going to put some context on that. I was just going to put the context on like the difference between, say, a fire safety assessment being done by somebody who's got competence in health and safety, or the difference between somebody, and I would have plenty of clients who are architects that I would help improve their competence. We do projects together. You know, somebody who might know buildings really well, and the examples I use of that are to do with life safety systems in particular. It's one thing to know that there's a fire alarm system installed in a building, to know that the system is maintained and serviced, to review the documentation that's there. But it's another thing to know whether that fire alarm system achieves L1 as might be required in that building type. It's one thing to know that there's emergency lighting in, have a ballpark sense that it's where it should be, and it's another thing to have enough competence to know that we don't actually have sufficient light in that particular location. So it is most definitely the case that there's a level of fire safety knowledge that can still be applied to most buildings. You know, you can I don't mean anyway, but somebody with reasonable competence can tell whether a fire door is functioning, or can tell whether a fire alarm system is operational, or an emergency lighting system is operational, or whether or not there's an adequate fire evacuation plan for the building or whatnot. It takes a whole other level of competence. I have 12 years university training behind me. It takes a whole other level of competence, and I wouldn't even do performance-based fire engineering because I haven't experienced working in a design team at that level. It's a totally different level of competence to be able to walk into a building, look at a client straight in the face and say, you need to give me €1 million to do work to your building. You know, that's the scale of your problem. That's not something that somebody should, do a 1-year postgrad course in, tacked onto the back of, a general construction type degree. That's, so we have to be clear as to the levels of fire risk assessment, as to the competence associated with those levels. And if we're talking about the kind of fire risk assessment Sean expects, there's really nobody but a fire engineer is competent to deliver that type of fire.
I think if I could just come in on that, it's an interesting topic, the whole competency element of it, and it's difficult to put a benchmark on that, and I suppose I sort of relate to my own private industry experience in working both in the UK and here in Ireland. And it's an interesting one that you make there in relation to having like something like the BCAR assessment, in terms of you do your course and you reach a certain criteria. I suppose when the RRO came into the UK, it was very much a case of, I suppose, for want of a better term, painters by night and fire risk assessors by day, and that would be my concern as to where industry would go with that, and how do you benchmark that, in the UK initially when the RRO came out, anybody doing, I suppose, a 2 or 3 day course in fire risk assessments was deemed to be, I suppose, a fire risk assessor, and that's my concern as to where how it's managed here in Ireland to prevent that. Now in the UK, they have ramped it up by bringing in the UCAS accreditation and so on, and there's a benchmark there. We'd certainly need to be, I suppose, looking for a high quality benchmark, so that.
You're absolutely right, Sean. It's I mean, and that's it. It's let's learn a lesson from the UK. The process that they followed, it ended up just being ridiculously diluted, and so we do not want to go down that road either. But we do need to have a clear way that it's not about somebody going right. One of the 74 people I think we have now, 76 people. Literally saying, "Oh, right, where do I start now?" And it's like, I have no idea. And most importantly, that they probably do a route on Google. They find somebody who says they're a fire risk assessor, and they don't know, because they don't know what they don't know. They don't know how to weed that out in terms of, are they the right person or not for them. An
interesting point you made there as well with regards to the architects and I suppose I think one of the requirements of the code of practice is that they're registered under the RAI. I suppose an interesting one for me personally is, I suppose, what is covered under, I suppose, the education of an architect? I suppose what level of modules or education is within that, I suppose, degree process? I suppose, okay, if I'm a structural if I'm a structural engineer, I'm not going to go to a fire consultant to do structural engineering calculations. I'm not discrediting the architect's perspective at all. I suppose, is that an area that can be enhanced under the RIAI?
Can I jump in there for a moment and address the 74 people there that you mentioned? I'm not supposed to be hearing from me today. I'm supposed to be sitting in the background and letting the conversation roll. But I just have to say that with the exception of Chris, I've worked with the other 3 people on site in different capacities. And what you're hearing from is probably the most proactive team, proactive people in their respective areas that I have come across. So if they're having difficulties with this, well, they're leading the way. I would like to come back very quickly and talk about BCAR, Building Control Amendment Regulations. When that structure was put in place, and it's much envied, as I said elsewhere, when that was put in place, a system of ancillary certification was put in place. And I would like to ask Chris, is that the sort of plan with the building management, with fire risk assessment? Is there a structure, a support structure envisaged? And if so, I mean, various people have touched on the competencies either at that level or feeding into that level. That's one element of it. I would also just comment very quickly that where I see BCAR working well, it's in major new construction projects where you have a multidisciplinary design team and you have the capacity to do all of what has been suggested here. And in quite a number of cases, the likes of AIR, you're involved in that process. I know in some buildings, you're seeing at an early stage. Too often, Claire has mentioned the one-man band architect, and with all due respect to architects, they're designers, they're conceptual people. How can one individual understand everything that's needed to be in place? It just simply isn't there. I think there's a framework required. I think we've made a very good step with BCAR, and this is a further step that Chris is announcing to us today. But I think there's quite a road to travel.
I mean, I think, David, you and I have talked about this often because I would lean on you for technical competence to do with passive when I have reached my limitations of knowledge. As a self-employed individual, the most dangerous position I'm ever in is in a position where I don't know what I don't know, and I'm moving forward on the belief that I understand what I need to do. So if we take even one technical component of a building, we've talked about them already, to do with dampers or to do with collars or wraps on pipework. If you may have read the little section in Technical Guidance Document B that alludes to when you need dampers or pipes, dampers or you need collars or wraps on pipes, or when you need a damper in a duct. But if you've not engaged in watching them being installed, asking questions of the people who know, leaning on somebody like yourself who's passive specialist, you don't know what you don't know. So you're standing there on a construction site going, that's grand because it looks right, it's clean, it's tidy, the builder's doing a good, he looks like he's doing a right job. And there you are signing off on that, saying that it's fine when it's not. So to me, everything that we talk about to do with occupied buildings is anchored on the back that from the top down, there's a lack of competence. Owners don't understand what they need to know. They hire FM consultants and FM contractors who quite often don't know what they need to know. They hire building managers who quite often don't know what they need to know. They bring in advisors often with the best of intentions, and they happen to pick, people who are more accessible or more affordable or whatever. And all the way across the business, people are operating within their own competence and their own knowledge base, but not knowing what they don't know. And so I have had scenarios where I've gone to a site 3 years after somebody was on, somebody not necessarily of my caliber, but somebody with a similar hat to me, and had a client say, but this guy 3 years ago told me that was fine. And I'm standing there going, sorry, that person didn't know what they were talking about. And the client is, devastated that they had spent 50,000 doing something, fixing a problem, that the person didn't give them sound advice at all. So, if we think about what this is engineering. This is, serious bells and whistles engineering. It's like structural engineering in terms of what you can do wrong. You would never expect your builder to know how to install your structural steel for your Dermot Bannon Bay window without a structural engineer involved. So we have to move it to that point where people stop treating fire safety like slips, trips and falls and like, you know, other minor soft fire, you know, health and safety stuff, and they start moving to this is about buildings, building structure, building design, means of escape, and stuff that's gone wrong. History tells us that it's gone wrong. We know the building stock is poor, and so people have to start elevating it to a point where they go looking for really competent, credible advice. You don't go to your GP to ask them whether or not you've got cancer. You go to somebody who specialises in that because you know you want that robust advice. Your GP sends you on that way. So that's the point. You know, we need to move it to a point where people get that, with especially in occupied existing buildings, that don't make any assumption that your building is sound. Operate on the opposite. Assume that there's flaws in your building from the construction stage, and you need to actively go out to find those flaws. And you need to be looking for competent fire engineers or fire consultants with a significant experience in fire engineering to point that stuff out to you. And it's going to be tedious, and it's going to be time consuming, and it's not going to be cheap, because it's hard to find that stuff when it's covered up after the fact. So
and
to me,
just to add to that point, Claire, I think you're absolutely right. I think, and this is again looking at the over umbrella group of being FM. I think, look, the market demands, the landlords in a lot of cases are very conscious of costs. They're conscious that they don't want to run up high service charges to their tenants. So therefore, there's a little bit of a race to the bottom of the barrel on the property management side in terms of the costs for managing the leases and managing service charges and all that sort of stuff. And so, with all respect to the property managers, they're given typically huge portfolios of buildings to manage. They're really only scraping the surface in terms of this sort of stuff, because their priority, as I said, is managing service charges, managing relationships, that sort of stuff. And then it's even worse again, I'm afraid, in the residential market, because it's absolutely about keeping the numbers down to the bare minimum. And unless there's something, I think, probably with a very sharp teeth that would force the position on the residential side, I think it's going to take a long time for that to change. You know,
I mean, one of the examples I'm just going to follow up with that, Chris, maybe that just might inform you in terms of BCAR too, is I would be aware of very valuable buildings, commercial buildings, sometimes large commercial retail buildings that would change hands, and as part of the due diligence at sale, they would engage fire consultants far superior to me in terms of their capacity to do very expensive due diligence around the building, very detailed forensic assessment of the building, purely to batter the sale price down, using it as a negotiation tool. Yet I know, because I've been involved in multiple of these buildings after the fact, they would have, let's say, 5 million euros worth of defects, occupy the building, become the new owner, and do nothing to remediate that work. So they've hired a fire consultant to identify problems, to bring the sale price down, and then, as the new owners of the building, feel zero obligation to remediate what was pointed out to them at the point of sale. And to me, that's a really dangerous place we're in, where owners, actual building owners, feel no moral obligation, no technical obligation to maintain the quality of the building stock that's out there. They're passing it down the chain and avoiding it,
Sorry, I did invite our attendees to ask some questions, and there's a number have come in. Can I address some of those to the panel, please? How can we, as an industry, simplify the myriad of regs and guidance and requirements for the layperson? That's come from Paul Daly.
This is not for the layperson, it seems. There's a myriad of legislation, not just the Health and Safety, the Fire Safety Act, the MUDS Act, all of the other acts that govern building ownership and building management. So again, the focus by the other speakers with respect to people who are competent and qualified and experienced in the area. And I do take your point about the competencies and developing those, and I certainly I know a number of architects who are quite competent in the fire safety area. I don't want to be impugning anyone, but certainly if there is a proposal there earlier for the a type of registration panel and what would be associated with that and how that might be activated. Certainly, that's something we would be actually very pleased to hear about. If that's something that's practical, that can be governed and can be simply put in place. Again, with a mind to not making it too complicated for people who are already qualified to be able to justify their status, if you like, you know.
I think just to say that to also address that question, I mentioned earlier, it's absolutely the register of competent people is important, but there's also a whole marketing exercise. There's a piece around this, you know, whether it be the equivalent of Danny O'Donnell on the telly just showing that the idea that you need a registered gas boiler ticket. It's the equivalent stuff. I know it's only a tiny piece of it, but it's about getting that message to the people on the ground. Claire mentioned it, owners of buildings, and let it trickle down the waterfall from there, that everybody understands that there's a need for this.
Yeah.
A piece of advice guiding people towards what the regulation is, and I think we had it somewhere in the conversation. At what point do you need to call in your professional advisor? Michael Lyons has asked two questions here. Does Section 19 of the Fire Services Acts inform the drafting of the code? That's one for you, Chris, obviously. And he also asked, what is the panel's view of the licensing by the fire authority of various buildings requiring a fire safety assessment of the registered building, e.g. office blocks or apartment blocks?
Yeah, well, yes, certainly we looked at and central to the whole development of the codes and the codes of practice we are the various relevant sections of the Fire Services Act. And indeed, I need to mention my colleagues on the subcommittee who developed this document, and all of them serving fire officers of various seniority. So yeah, we're certainly. That's the central plank, if you like, where we're bouncing from with developing these and other documents.
Donald Toland has asked, where can people involved in FM who have acquired knowledge over time find training on the basics of fire safety? Thanks.
So it depends what you mean by the basics of fire safety. So, I mean, I'm assuming you're asking that question, attending this course, as you mean the basics so that you can apply some fire safety knowledge in a building that you're responsible for. And the answer to that is only, in my opinion, with third level study. You know, there's a postgraduate course in Trinity. There's a course now down in Waterford. There's a full-time undergraduate course in Letterkenny. There's some master's programs in Queen's. I did my master's in Leeds. There's lots of them in the UK. So I mean, there really isn't any content out there beyond your one-day course that you'd send your fire warden on, that would, that would provide any information that we would be comfortable. That you find some such courses in the UK for sure, but I'd be advocating that.
Yeah.
Sorry, John.
Sorry, Claire. I think just to add to that, I think of recent times, Letterkenny Institute of Technology have brought in a course for fire safety management. That's an area that they were looking at in recent times. And I think the lead director up there on that particular course is Anne Boner. She's from the LYIT in Donegal. That's an area that was being looked at as part of, I suppose, a sideline with the fire safety engineering degree program up there, that they were looking at a separate program for fire safety management.
I think just to point out that if alternatively the question is about somebody in FM gaining the knowledge to know what they don't know, and that's as far as they want to go, then it's a difficult one. Obviously, there are lots of briefing sessions like this. I'm afraid we in Acacia have probably built it up over time by in a lot of cases, deliberately, proactively trying to learn from the specialists like David, like Claire, and from but very much knowing where the line of the sand is to what at a point that we stop and say, now we need to. We are not the experts and never will be the experts. Now we bring them in.
I should probably follow with that here with a slight joke, which says, if I'm your fire consultant, you'll know a hell of a lot more when I'm finished working with you for a year or two than before you started. So I would tend to find that the building managers and the FM people I work with, they're learning off the nature of doing a fire safety project, because I need them to understand what we're at. I need them to follow what we're spending money on. So it may very well be the best thing that you can do, Donal, is actually engage in a fire safety project with a fire consultant and learn through that project, and then you'll have it to bring forward in the future.
I think you've included, when you say a year or two, you're providing a vision of what actually is involved in a lot of instances. It's not a 5-minute conversation. 5
years is more like.
We're not talking about a 5-minute conversation. Paul Daly has put another question in. What is the best practice being used in this regard? Fire risk assessor competence in Ireland. Is it PAS 79?
Yeah, we've experienced, I suppose, fire safety assessments coming into ourselves there in DFB that would take the format of PAS 79. And whilst it's a good basis, I suppose the important one is that it doesn't become a tick box exercise, and that's the key here. We're demonstrating building regulation compliance, and I suppose it's an area that, I suppose, in Ireland, predominantly it's the PAS 79 that would have been used as the basis. There's been a lot of input and thought put into that over the years, and it has got better and with time. It would be a good basis, yeah.
Again, I'm going to add just something and say, Paul, sorry, David.
Go ahead.
No, what I was going to add, Paul, is if you're doing a core root and branch fire safety assessment of your building's compliance, it's very safe and explanatory. Start at B1, work your way through means of escape, work your way through vertical and horizontal evacuation, work your way through the fire alarm system, the emergency light. I as a fire consultant don't need a format to follow to know what it is I should be looking at and to know what it is I'm assessing. What to follow on from what Sean's saying is PAS 79 might give me a package to put my content into that looks familiar to clients or that justifies a fee price that I'm presenting. But you could strip away PAS 79 and my fire assessments are still going to contain the content that they need to, because I'm looking at the stuff that needs to be looked at. So we started with, as Chris referred to, looking at code of practice pressures, which I used recently myself on a fire risk assessment, or the code of practice for fire safety in flats, or technical guidance document B, with maybe a little bit of softening around the edges. That'll give you a very clear indication of the kind of problems areas that you have. They'll always be to do with the fire alarm, the emergency lighting, compartmentation, holes in walls that shouldn't be there. The issues are always the same, so it's just about going looking for them.
Shauna, you're trying to get it in there. Can I just say that we're 15 minutes over at this point in time. The conversation is very good. We have another few minutes just to kind of wrap up, and I just want to add in one question which I asked at the beginning, and I said, what consideration must designers give to future management and maintenance? And I'm going to add in to that a little bit insofar as we talked about the fire safety certificate process, whereby you have typically a fire consultant or an assigned certifier, design certifier, somebody of that competency applying for the certificate, doing the design to code or fire and engineer design. But typically they're relying upon a myriad of other designers, mainly from the industry, be it the active or passive industries or wherever. There's a breadth of knowledge out there from an industry point of view. I've just been referred to by a couple of times as being an expert in something. I'm not a chartered anything, but there's a lot of people with a lot of knowledge, and we need somehow or another to find a framework as to how that knowledge can be used within a structure. Assigned certifiers are allowed delegate responsibility in certain areas once they take the overarching responsibility. And I think the same thing has to happen with regard to fire safety management. And the final point I'm saying is I put in the middle of that list from design to management, I put inspection. You know, inspection as the process goes on is very important, and those records must be passed on to the management team. Sorry to take so long in saying that, but I do think we've kind of put a picture together today. Can I just say, can we maybe give everybody a couple of minutes to wrap up what where they're at from this particular conversation, and maybe a couple more minutes then to respond, and we've a deadline of 4:30 to wrap up. Air, do you want to kick off and a final couple of words? You don't have 5 minutes this time.
No, don't worry, David. It's a 1 minute just to say. Look, I think really more addressing the people from the FM side. I think that it's all about all of us desperately trying to raise our game in terms of knowledge of this complex beast that is fire safety, and as we've touched on there, in the absence of anything else for the time being, it's about engaging with good, strong, competent people. Hopefully, through the good work Chris is doing, we can narrow that down and tighten it down a little bit more as to how to define competency. And so on that basis, I would like Chris has done, actually really ask that everybody take a look at the draft document and give their feedback on it.
Claire?
I mean, I think for me, it's about lack of assumption. You know, operate on the basis that you can't assume that you're building that you're responsible for in whatever format that responsibility sits with you, that you can't assume that it's sound. Certainly my experience would be that it's not. So you need to go and forensically engage with professionals to forensically assess and find out where your weaknesses are in your building. Have you fire alarm issues? Have you emergency lighting issues? Have you compartmentation issues? Have you fire stopping issues? And then, you know, I suppose that I would say put on the big boy pants and figure out, like, how am I going to get this translated into something that my client can understand, if you happen to be the client, even better, and how do we go through a process of remediating that. But I think moving fire safety from maintaining systems into actually, do I have a fire alarm system that's adequate? Do I have compartmentation that's where it should be? Have I done anything to my building since that might have compromised my fire cert? They're the kind of questions that I think that building owners and people responsible for buildings need to be asking on foot of, you know, the general question of how do we manage occupied buildings? Stop making assumptions that it's okay and confirm that it's okay, establish that it's okay.
Sean?
Yeah, I suppose maybe just to touch on what Claire was saying there in terms of assumptions. There's perception out there that once a Dublin Fire Brigade or a local authority fire service inspect a building and have gone through, we'll say primarily we look at the life safety systems in terms of the certification for those as part of an inspection on a building, you know, and that can be your fire alarm system, your emergency lighting and your extinguishers and so on, you know. And I suppose the important message from a DFB perspective is to keep on top of all of that. Have all the life safety certification in place. Have a register that's fully updated, and not something that's updated on a weekly basis. It should be done on a daily basis. The daily checks need to be done daily. But also, I suppose there's a perception there that when we do inspect and we've looked at the certification and we leave the site, that, okay, everything's hunky-dory because the fire officer has been out there. That is not the case. The fire officer is not going to go above the ceiling, is going to go checking doors, going to checking gaps on doors, making sure that every door in the building has smoke seals and whatever it may be, and fire dampers are in place where they should be. That's not the fire officer's responsibility, but the perception out there is that is the case, you know. So that's the message that, look, I suppose the key driver here is get the professional advice, you know. Even if if a fire officer in the local area has been out there and inspected, the fire officer is more than likely only looking at it from a management perspective, i.e. looking at the life safety certification, that the end user is keeping the register updated and so on. But compartmentation, fire doors, they are the main issues, and they're the areas that need to be looked at, you know. So that's it for me, I guess. I want to thank you all for the time.
Chris, do you want to have the final word?
I'd echo what Sean has said about people's perception about what the visit from the fire officer might or might not mean. Nothing can absolve you of your legislative responsibility under the Fire Services Act, under the Health and Safety and Welfare Work Act, and under all of the other acts that may or may not be specific to fire safety. And nobody and nothing can absolve you of that. You need to understand that, and then you need to act on it as been suggested. And indeed, you might. Your local authority might be able to give you a steer as to competent people or not. There are registers available on the RIAI under the Engineers Ireland and the IFE, who are people who may be suitable and competent. So certainly we would be endorsing that and just reminding people that again, this is the law of the land, and you have to take that responsibility. With respect to our fire safety assessment document, I appreciate everything people has said, and I'm looking forward to engaging with you further with comments and that, because I think this is another step, if you like, perhaps to another piece of the jigsaw that will perhaps, at least in respect of the fire safety assessment, will give a bit of consistency and depth and address issues that may be relevant. And indeed, I hope that the following documents that we bring forward with respect to persons having control and their specific responsibilities, I think again will underscore what responsibilities are there. So I'd leave it at that again, and thanks everybody today. It was a pleasure to be here with all of you.
Can I just, there's one question that I didn't get to ask, and really this one is for Sean, and I think really to allay people's fears. There's a perception out there, if people find an issue in their buildings, they're afraid to ask for help. And the question is, what is an owner operator supposed to do if their fire risk assessment uncovers significant fire safety issues with the building? In 2 minutes, Sean, can you maybe give them a little bit of comfort that they will find you cooperating, or am I putting words into your mouth?
Yes, no, listen, of course that's our game at the end of the day is we will cooperate. I think the key message that I drive home from that perspective, David, is that whilst a fire safety assessment has been undertaken on a building and it outlines a series of deficiencies, the critical element is that there's a time frame put together for the works and how you demonstrate that you're being proactive under the Fire Services Act. But also, what mitigation measures are you proposing in the meantime during, I suppose, obviously, if there's issues picked up on the building is still likely to operate as per the norm. What mitigation measures are going to be brought into play to counteract the issues that have been found? So that, again, we're coming into here the professional advice you get as a facilities manager or operator, that is key. But certainly there's no reason why anybody shouldn't advise the fire brigade of an issue within a certain building. But it's not a case of advising us of issues and what do we do from here. There's professional bodies out there. There's consultants, architects, whatever it may be out there to advise you to take the appropriate next step,
So
and that's the key for us.
Just to sum that up, if somebody takes a reasonable approach, they're proactive in doing it, they engage confident people, and they provide you with a timeline, you're not going to jump in and shut them down.
I think that would be reasonable. Obviously the risk has to be assessed, and that's where the risk assessor comes into play.
That's
to look
what
at
I'm saying. If they've got competent people on side,
correct.
Hugh has joined us here and is anxious to wrap up. He's given me till 16:30. It's 16:26 now. Thank you all very, very much. I think that's been a very interesting discussion. Hopefully, the people that unfortunately are faceless in this virtual era have enjoyed the day and there's something out of it. Each of our contact details are available, and I think the presentations that you saw at the beginning of the afternoon will be made available for anybody who's looking for them. So again, thank you very much, and I'll hand back to Hugh. Maybe you want to say something?
Yeah, first of all, can I just thank you all for what was quite a very interesting discussion. It's left me with a number of questions that I think still need to be addressed, and competency and who is competent, I think, is going to be a critical one. What I did think is when we first arranged with David to put this panel together, he said, "I'm not sure I can fill an hour." We've been going through and I'm already shutting you down. Just to let you know, if the panelists are all agreed, we will make available all your PowerPoint slides. If you will want to communicate to the panel, please come through the Workplace and Facilities Expo website or through my own email address. We shall, through the course of this year, be holding, we're calling them Tech Focus Days, and I've already been in discussion with David to maybe do one linked again to fire safety, which may allow a little bit more time and a different way of approaching it to address these issues. And I would hope that I look forward to working with David and maybe all of you again on that. Chris, good luck with your consultation document. I think you may have a few comments coming in, but apart from that, I'd like to say thank you to you all. I hope you've enjoyed it. And well done. Thank you.